Hello there, welcome back to the Closet Historian and back to my sewing room as usual. Today we're going to be doing a little bit more pattern drafting, however. I've shown how to do the basic bodice block pattern that I use all the time from scratch. I'll put the card up to that here. It is a bit of a dry video, I will warn you now. And I've also done how to draft the sleeve that I use in my dressmaking. And today I will finish off this set by talking about how to draft the basic block skirt, which also happens to be a pencil skirt pattern. That's right, you can use this pattern to just make a pencil skirt. You don't have to have the bodice or the sleeve or the rest of the block pattern to use this. You can just make a pencil skirt if you would like to, and that is how I use this pattern quite often. I've made many a pencil skirt out of this pattern, so I wanted to show you, if you were interested in drafting your own pencil skirt patterns from scratch, how I go about it here in my sewing room. So let's jump on over to the blue patterning table of doom and get started. Let's talk for a moment about measurements. This is always kind of the more annoying part of these things when drafting from scratch, because I usually use standard measurement charts. I'm very lucky that they're not that different from my measurements on the higher end. We'll get to that in a minute. It's harder to find standard measurement charts outside of like fashion textbook sizes, which of course fashion leans very small, as we know. Hopefully this is something that is changing over the past few years, etc., etc. So these are the measurements I'm going to need to draft the pencil skirt. And this is the number that corresponds on this little body and on this form over here. The number of the measurement, so like dart measurement is 20, or dart placement, sorry. The dart placement is measurement number 20 over here. So it's here marked on our little formy form here. So these are the measurements I'm going to be using today in the order I use them, as opposed to arranged neatly. And this is, how to find them on this little person here. So, pause here if you'd like to see this page, and then also we will need this hip side depth up here. So number 26 up here, that's the other one. So those are the measurements and where they are on the body that I'll be using to draft a pencil skirt today. Now, I'm going to be using standard measurements from a chart. The chart from this book I've shown you all before. It's a lot of numbers and a lot of measurements. So these are the standardized measurement chart. Basically, the way that they found this measurements here is they measure a lot of people and then decide what the averages are, kind of, is I believe how this is done. But of course, this book is like nearly 10 years old at least. And those studies, God knows how old they are. But anyway, this is the standard measurement chart that I use to draft my patterns, because I use this book to draft my patterns. I go ahead and use the size 16. It's close enough to my measurements. My measurements are not perfect on this chart. Oh, our air conditioner has popped on outside. My apologies. But for example, my waist is like 31, or like a 30-31. My bust is actually 42. And 44 is probably my hip. I'm probably like a 43, really, in between here. So I'm kind of just in between these 2 or 3 sizes here at the top. And I usually just, because my waist is down here in the 14 and my like hip and bust is up here in the 18, I usually just draft a 16 and then adjust from there. That's just how I've worked it out over the years. This usually works for me. Of course, you must do what is right for you. But that's why this is a little highlighted, because those are the measurements I usually use to go ahead and draft like my basic stuff. Again, the first one you draft is not going to fit perfectly. You're going to have to make fixes to it. That's the thing about drafting a block pattern to use all the time, or drafting your sloper, your fitting shell. It's going to take several rounds to get it right. Less so for this skirt than it did for the bodice, but that's why I always say, if you want to just buy a sloper pattern or a fitting shell pattern and fit that to you, you're kind of skipping the from scratch part and just doing the fitting part. But no matter what, you can't skip the fitting part. So this is the measurement chart I'll be using today. I will put it on screen, and you can pause if you so desire. You'll notice, the other half of the chart, as I always say, is not here. This doesn't go over their size 18, whatever 18 means. I know that there must be resources out there for the rest of this chart, but I just have this book because it was my textbook for school, where they of course had us making the bottom range for a mannequin, not for people. In fact, in the 3 different fashion schools I attended, 4 different fashion schools I attended, none of them taught us to fit clothes or make clothes for real humans, they taught us how to make them for a very small mannequin, a size 6 or 8 mannequin, usually a size 8 mannequin. So I'm coming from a fashion school background, again, a dated fashion school background. I've been out of college for a long time now. So that's why I'm used to drafting things on the small end and why my references are all on the small end as well. I apologize for this, but this is just my experience. There are lots of people out there on the internet who can help you with drafting plus size patterns, quote unquote plus size. You know, even though the average size of people is here, in fashion they think the average size is down here. So again, this is something that I simply cannot solve as one human who went to fashion school a few years ago and now sort of teaches sort of sewing on the internet, unfortunately. But this is the chart I'll be using today. These measurements, I took these measurements from here on the chart. Again, the numbers correspond to the numbers over here, so I took those measurements that I needed and I'll be using them to draft my pencil skirt today. So here are the instructions I will be using today to go ahead and draft this skirt as well. You can see in these little blank spaces I filled in the measurements from that other chart. The only other chart we're going to be needing today is the personal dart intake chart up here, which the amount of intake you need on your darts in the front and back, we're going to be doing 4 darts, 2 on the front, 2 on the back. And then the way you find which kind of intake you need is you take your waist measurement and subtract it from the hip measurement. So in my case, my hip measurement is 43 minus 31. My waist is going to be 12 inches of difference. 12 inches of difference, I need 2 darts that are 5/8 in the front, and the back will be 2 darts that are 1 1/8 intake. This again is, you know, a standardized thing. It may need to be different for you. You will find that out once you make your first mock-up and see what's going on, but this is just general for doing your first version of this pattern. This is the kind of thing they recommend. Alright, here we are above the blue patterning table of doom, as usual, although a different top-down view today. I've got some pens here and other supplies for doing my pattern drafting today, including some big, huge paper shears. Normally I would, of course, use pencil, but I will be using pencil and pen interchangeably today so that you can all see what I'm doing here on camera. I have a measuring tape in case I need to take my measurements, and of course, my clear ruler that I usually use for pattern drafting. I prefer these clear 2-inch wide rulers for this. And then I also have some Scotch tape here in case I need to tape anything back together. And I have, of course, a piece of alphanumeric paper here. And then this is a hip curve ruler, which is also something you will need. It's not like absolutely essential. You can get around not using it, but it is nice to have a hip curve ruler, and you will see why later. Again, rulers like this one here, the clear and the hip curve, are usually available at sewing shops and definitely available online. So to start with, I'm going to square off line down the middle here, which is going to be between the front and back of our skirt pieces eventually. And this is point A here at the top, down to point B, which is going to be the skirt length. Now this isn't on the measurement chart. You just choose how long you want your skirt to be. Normally I make my pattern 29 inches long because I usually want my skirts to be around 27 or 28 inches long when they're finished. And why add seam allowance when I can just incorporate it into the length of the skirt? So I'm just drawing the central line from A to B, the skirt length, 29 inches. And this ruler is 18 inches long, so I'll put B down here, and then I'll rearrange our paper because most of the work we'll be doing is up here at the top. All right, so now from A to B we have, but now we need to draw A to C. And that is going to be the center front hip depth, measurement 25, which for me is going to be 8 3/4 of an inch. So I've just come down 8 3/4 of an inch, and I will mark that point C. So I have point A, B, and C now, and I can go ahead and move on to the next measurement. Okay, so squaring out from A here, we're going to do A to D, which is the back hip arc measurement, plus 1/2 inch of ease, which for me is going to be a total of 11 1/4 inches up here. So I need to come out 11 1/4 inches. Again, sorry about the fractions today. You know, the imperial measurement system, ain't it great? So 11 1/4, 11 1/4 out from A, I now have point D. Now the instructions are a little bit confusing here. It says squared out from A, C, and B equal to A, D, draw center line F to D, label E and F. But basically what they're asking you to do is square down from D here, and then at the C level, again, equal to A to C, you're going to do D to E. So I'm drawing a squared line down from that mark D, and then at the same level of C, which was that 8 3/4 of an inch down, I'm going to square off this area as well here too, and then that new point I created on the left-hand side here is going to be point E, is what I think they're trying to say. But honestly, I think the book phrases it very strangely, and sometimes it's like interpreting the book is half of the challenge here. I'm just going to go ahead and square that all the way across because we are going to be putting another point out here somewhere on this side. So figured while we were here, I'll just square across. Anyway, this is point E now. Now we have to put in another mark, which is just a little bit of a lowering on the back central point of the skirt, which is to put out a mark up here called G, which is the center back hip depth measurement. So measuring up from E, we use that measurement. So just a tiny bit lower than that D mark. Go ahead and put that there and mark it G, which will come in handy later. Up here, from A to H is going to be the front hip arc plus 1/2 inch of ease. Again, just all squared out right now. Everything at 90 degree angles, essentially. And then squared out from A, C, and B equal to A, H, aka square down from H as well. I don't know why they have to say it in such a funny way. Like, they should just say square down from H to hemline and mark at hip level I. It would make more sense. So again, I'm just squaring down from H here, and I will mark the new point that's created here on the right, point I. Many people ask me where I get my dot paper, or alphanumeric paper as is known, because it has numbers and letters, and it is from a website called Atlas Levy, and I will link that in the description here. I'm now drawing from D to K here, which is going to be the kind of waist length of our back skirt here, and that is the back waist arc plus 1/4 inch and then added dart intake, which altogether for me comes to 10 1/4 of an inch. So it's the back waist arc measurement, again, plus 1/4 inch, and then the dart intake from that dart intake chart, which for me is 1 1/4 inches, or no, 1 1/8 inches, sorry, for my back darts. So 1 1/8 inches times 2, so put that in there, and I get 10 1/4 for this mark K. Now I've come out from D to L here. That's the dart placement measurement, which for me is 3 13/16, another one of my favorite measurements. So ridiculous. And then you mark the 1 1/8 for the first dart. In between there, I've marked 1 1/4 inch, and then I'm marking again right now. Right here, I'm going to be marking another 1 1/8 of an inch for the second dart. So I have this dart here and this dart here. From D to L, again, was that dart placement measurement, 3 13/16. Then I come out one of my dart intake lengths, and then 1 1/4 inch in between, and another dart intake there. And then from K, it just wants you to square up and down. Again, this will come in handy later. And now we're going to go ahead and mark the darts on the front of the skirt. So again, we're using the dart placement measurement to do this. But first we have to go from the front waist arc, from H to M here. So again, it's front waist arc plus 1/4 inch ease, and then added the dart intake. For me, the dart intake is going to be 5/8 of an inch for each dart on the front. So 5/8 of an inch times 2 plus the front waist arc equals 9 5/8 for me. So I've marked that M 9 5/8, and here I am marking the dart placement again, 3 13/16. And then I will come 5/8 out from point N, well, 5/8 in almost. So 5/8 of an inch in, that's going to be my first front dart here. And then again, 1 1/4 inch in between. There we go. And then another 5/8 for the other dart. Very similar to how I did the back, just with different dart intake. And these two are going to end up being my darts here. And there we are. Again, we're going to square up and down from M again to use as a guide later. Now we are starting to draw in the hip side curve here soon, which requires taking, again, the instructions here are very strange. So I will show you how I ended up doing this. Taking the hip curve ruler, you can see that there's a straight sort of section on this ruler, and that is what I lined up with point C down here. So I lined up the side of this ruler with the line at C, which right now is our side seam kind of between the two pieces here. So I've lined that up, and then I've just like scooched or like slid it up along the straight edge until the curved edge hit the mark squaring K, you know, where we squared off that line from K. So here I'm just sliding the ruler up along this straight line up until it hits this mark K at the measurement that is equal to side hip depth. I know this is confusing. I'm using the ruler to measure, but not using the number markers on the ruler, just using the indicators. So when this line from C to up where it's hitting the line squared from K is equal to 9 5/8, which is what I thought my side hip measurement was, which I was incorrect, and we'll get to this in a second. I'm actually doing this incorrectly right now. I'm doing it properly, but I'm using the wrong measurement, I guess. I'm supposed to be sliding this up until it's 8 7/8 from here at C, so to count up 8 7/8, but instead I'm accidentally counting up 9 5/8, so about an inch higher than I need this to be. But again, you're just like lining up the straight edge of the bottom of this curved ruler with the straight side seam, sliding it up until the measurement you want hits this squared off line. So the method I'm using here is correct. I just unfortunately have made it about an inch too high, which you will see when I put my actual pattern that I use all the time next to this one. You'll see exactly what that means and what it looks like. So unfortunately, I am using the wrong measurement, but I am, I think, using the correct technique. So again, for the other side here, we're going to do the same kind of thing, lining up the ruler. Here I am marking out how far I need it to go, even though, again, I'm 1 inch off, practically. But again, lining up the straight edge down here, and then sliding the ruler up until it hits that measurement I want. I'm measuring up from 16, really, here. And then where it hits that squared off line off of M up at the top of the waist, that is where I will draw in my curve. But again, sadly, I'm doing this an inch off. If I didn't make like some sort of a damning mistake in these pattern drafting, like more serious pattern drafting videos, would it really be me, you know? I've got to make one mistake that I don't catch until I'm later here editing the video, naturally. Now the last step here is to use the shallow end of the curved ruler to square off, or like to draw in the curve for the waistline. So up here we're going from, instead of going from D to that new mark we have created, we're going from that line G. We put in that little mark G a tiny bit down earlier, and that is for this purpose, so that we can connect this back waistline to have this curve. And again, my curve will be too extreme because of my making that side hip depth mistake. So don't make my same mistake. But again, if only all of us were filming each step of the process so we could see where we messed up, you know? Because like here, if I went ahead and made a muslin out of the skirt and was like, what the heck is going on? I could watch this video back and be like, oh, I see. And then see where my mistake was, which is kind of convenient. You see me putting little cross marks that you probably can't see here on camera on the lines I want to keep. I do that quite often in pattern drafting. I will put little hatch marks on the finished line so I know when I'm cutting it out which line is the one I need to pay attention to. Now I'm just going through and finding the center of each dart here. So here in the back, in the dart, between the darts here, I'm just finding where the center is of each of those darts, and we're going to measure down, and the book tells me to measure 5.5 inches down for the back darts here. So in the center of each dart, I'm squaring a line down, perfect 90-degree angle, down 5.5 inches from the center of each dart here, and then I can go ahead and connect the dart legs to the dart point here, just so I can see what's going on with my darts in the back. And yes, I still can't believe I made that mistake. All right, and in the front here, you're going to square down 3.5 inches is what the recommendation is. And you will see it's quite different on my actual pattern that I use all the time. My darts are actually quite a bit longer than this. And I don't remember when or why I changed them, but over the years, I apparently at one point decided that my darts in the front of my skirt pattern needed to be longer. I like the way my skirt pattern fits. I sometimes get comments saying, you know, my clothes here on the channel don't all fit the same or don't all fit me perfectly. And that's probably true for many reasons, but you know, the main one of which being that I made them with older patterns several years ago. A lot of my clothes I made almost 10 years ago now, and they're still holding up just fine. And so my body has probably changed a little bit since then, and my pattern has changed a little bit since then. So all my clothes don't fit the same unless I've made them, you know, within the last couple of years. But things I made before then may fit me a little bit differently now, or the pattern was a little bit different then, because my pattern I have adjusted over the years to be more to my liking. Anyway, here I am just drawing in the lines that we're going to use to cut out, just so you can see them better on camera. Of course, I would just cut out along the pencil line. It's pen line today, but normally it would be pencil line, to show you which line you would actually cut out for this, if you were to cut out this pattern. And again, I don't know why when I was doing this I couldn't tell that that line in the center here is just too high up, that curve, but you know, I was trying to make sure I was getting everything on camera and leads to fatal mistakes here. All right, so I'm just going to finally continue these side lines down. Now at this point, if you were making more of a pencil skirt and you wanted this to come in a little bit at the bottom, you would go ahead and taper those lines down to a slimmer end point here. So down here at line B, 29 inches long is how I want my skirt to be. I'm squaring it off because I like to have my pencil skirts and my basic skirt pattern to be squared or like a straight skirt. But again, you could come in a couple of inches on either side and have your skirt narrow. Well, not a couple of inches, probably 1 inch on each side. And remember, like, that center line there is the side seam, so you want to come in 1 inch from either side of that center line too if you're going to taper the skirt down. Hopefully that makes sense. Now here I am cutting this all out. Now, of course, some areas of this are going to need seam allowance if you were to go ahead and start to try and use this pattern. So we'll talk about that. So along here, well, let's label this before things get any more confusing, the front and the back. Sorry people are stomping around upstairs. I don't know what's going on. Maybe there's an Irish jig competition I wasn't informed of. Anyway, this point here is going to be the center front, so we don't need any seam allowance to be added here. But of course, where we cut them apart in the middle there, each side is going to need a seam allowance there because that's the side seam. So we're going to need seam allowance on each of these edges, also on the top edge, and then the center back you'll need seam allowance for putting in your zipper and sewing the center back and stuff like that. So however much seam allowance you want to add back there, however much you want to add in the center. Usually I use 1/2 inch everywhere except for my center backs. Usually I use a little bit more there just because I like to have some wiggle room when it comes to putting in zippers. But you're going to need to tape on some extra paper here and put on your seam allowance. I'm just grabbing my actual pattern here. Here's my card version of my pattern. Again, this is just poster board from the craft store or from Walgreens, and lining up this new pattern on top of my actual one that I use all the time. And you can see how much higher that side waist comes up because of making that side hip depth mistake. So I don't even know, but you can see how similar it is. If I had the seam allowance along this edge, it would line up quite well, except for this top place where I made a mistake. So the moral of the story is don't make mistakes when pattern drafting, you know? Even after 10 years of doing it, I still make apparently fatal mistakes. And again, for the back here, lining this up, again, if I had seam allowance on that other side and on the center back as well, then this would again line up quite perfectly. But again, the top edge comes up that little too high at the side seam just because I miscorrected or measured the hip depth of the side there. But in general, also my patterns are quite a lot shorter than the actual 29 inches that I like to use, and that's because the poster board only comes in one width, so I couldn't actually make these as long as I would like, so I just mark the poster board with how long they are, and then draw on the extra bit whenever I trace them, which is unfortunate but true. And here's the tracing of my card copy that I use when I'm actually pinning this to fabric and cutting it out. You don't want to pin the card copy to fabric. That would be very impractical, but here's my actual pattern on the right here and the new one from today on the left. Of course, the one from today is very similar, but I would notice there was things going off at the waist very quickly where I had to try and use it. Now, if you were to use this to make a pencil skirt, you might be thinking, what about my waistband here? Well, I don't make a waistband pattern because I just use a length of fabric that, is along the straight grain that is longer than maybe 33 inches and about 3 or 4 inches wide, usually about 4 inches wide and maybe 35 or 36 inches long. Just cut that strip off my fabric when I'm cutting something out, and then I use that to attach and make into a waistband. So I don't really make waistband patterns, I just cut out a strip to use as waistband. And I try and make sure I do that along the straight grain because usually when I'm using say a stretch sateen or something like that, I don't want this area to stretch lengthwise across the waistband. But I don't really use waistband patterns, I just make them, and you'll see that next week in a pencil skirt sewing video that I'll be doing. So here is the pattern that I'll be using for that, which is my usual pattern, not this new one, just because I've gone through a couple of little fitting changes on my pattern that of course the new one does not have. So, once you make a pattern like this, when you're drafting completely from scratch from measurements, especially from a standardized measurement chart, you're going to want to make a muslin and then go ahead and see if that fits you the way you would like. Again, I've made little changes over the years, so many that I hardly remember why or when or how. That's kind of my process for fitting things. I've never had a professional fitting training. It's something I would love to do one day, of course, when such things as, in-person tailoring training is a thing again, because I assume right now, not so much. But, maybe there's some online training I could take when I do finally get the time. So that is how I draft my basic block skirt pattern, my pencil skirt pattern that I use all the time here in my sewing room. As I always say, you may have additional fit issues just because every body is different and not necessarily standard like all the pattern drafting books, like to assume. I think pattern drafting books all assume that we are mannequins or making clothes for mannequins and not for people. And of course, all people are uniquely shaped and you may have unique fitting issues that unfortunately I certainly do not know how to handle because I can barely, I barely have finally gotten a handle on how to fit things for myself, and some would even say I'm not very good at that. So unfortunately I'm not a fit expert, but luckily the internet is, so I always recommend typing in any individual fit issues you may have into Google, crease across back of pencil skirt pattern. Search that into Google and you will be surprised how many resources and blog posts and things like that come up to help you resolve those fit issues. We're all going to have our own unique things to fix on our patterns, and luckily, well, they're unique until you get online and then suddenly there's hundreds of other people who have had to deal with the same thing and will teach you how to fix yours as well. Again, next week I'll be going into detail on how to actually cut and sew the pencil skirt, so if that is something you're interested in, stay tuned, subscribe, all those YouTubey things, and I will see you then next week for the sewing pencil skirt video. Bye.